Thank you very much. Thank you for coming back after lunch. Thank you to the Commissioner for setting up the context for our panel very nicely. We're going to be opening up the debate to talk about some of the global issues, also talk about consumers. Let's not forget them. It was excellent this morning. For those who weren't here, there was an absolute tour de force from Mrs. Georgieva, who left us with an impression of the apocalypse with Moses struck down by the transition to a green economy. I'd remind you that he was also part of the transition to a digital economy, given he was the first person to get a tablet with data from the cloud. You're welcome. Okay, now, we've got two panelists today. I'm going to introduce them, but you'll notice that we're missing a third, who is a late change on the panel, Sebastian Siemiatkowski, the CEO of Klarna. Unfortunately, couldn't make it at the last minute. What does that mean? It's more time for you. This is making markets work for the people, making moderators work for the people. So please put your hand up if you've got a question, if you've got a contribution. For those at home, you can use Slido. For those in the room, just put your hand up. There'll be some time for Q&A at the end, but if you've got anything to say in the meantime, please do attract my attention. So on my right-hand side, they're both on my right-hand side, we've got Monique Goyens of BEUC, which is a consumer group, an umbrella organization which brings together 45 different consumer groups across Europe. Basically, if you've ever bought anything in Europe, Monique speaks for you. Yeah. No pressure. And then we've got Fiona Morton, who'll be very well known to many of you as well, who's at the Yale School of Management, also formerly served at the US Department of Justice as Deputy Assistant Attorney General. I'm Lewis Crofts, I'm a journalist, I ask the questions. So how it's going to work is we're going to have some opening statements just to frame the debate by these two, and then we'll go into the discussion, and there's time for Q&A at the end. Fiona would like to start.
Okay, thank you. Thanks for the invitation to be here. It's been really interesting this morning. I wanted to continue Mrs. Vesteyer's theme. How can, I'm going to call it capitalism, make people better off? So making markets work for people. I think we want to think about that as capitalism. I'm a fan of capitalism, but for it to work properly, you need rules of the road. If you don't have appropriate rules of the road for markets, then they don't produce outcomes that we want. They don't produce outcomes that make people happy. So why is that the case? And it's the case because people are fallible. They don't have training to evaluate whether an automobile is safe. They don't have information about the features, all the features of the car or the features of the loaf of bread or whatever it might be. They don't want to spend their time learning about the fuel efficiency of a car, figuring out a metric for it and comparing it to the fuel efficiency of the next car. They want to pay €1 every year in taxes, to have there be a government agency to set those standards and measure those things and help them choose between cars that way. Okay, so we need basic things like weights and measures and disclosures, information provision, nutrition labels, this sort of thing. People also have behavioral biases. We have now 40 years worth of research about consumers who are time inconsistent, consumers who overly respond to defaults, consumers who are excessively optimistic or risk averse or risk loving. We all suffer from, we procrastinate, we suffer from all these problems. And we would call these internalities in the jargon. And another thing that governments can do to make markets work better is help consumers manage their own internalities by disallowing firms from preying on those weaknesses and setting up things like, in the United States, we have something called an annual percentage rate that has to be printed in a very large font if you receive a credit card offer in the mail. And that's so that whatever complex schedule of rates over time that the bank has set, it can be boiled down using a formula set by the government to be 15 or whatever it might be, and the consumer can compare that to another offer of 10 and decide that 15 is a higher interest rate than 10 and choose the better credit card. Okay, consumers need help doing that sort of thing, and if they have that help, then banks are incentivized to compete on the interest rate, which is a dimension that is salient, it's very important to consumers because that's their money. Okay, so that's why we have these rules. it's easy for a competition authority, particularly one combined with the consumer protection function, to deal with competition and making competition better in all of the contexts I've just mentioned, where you've got disclosures, asymmetric information, and the internalities, behavioral consumers. The problem comes when there's externalities. Why? Because the externalities are, by definition, in a different market. And when we do competition, we think about the consumers in a market, those consumers, what they're buying, and their welfare. And if it's therefore something that the product is doing to them, a consumer in that market is being hurt by that thing, the consumer and the product are all in the same market, we're good. The externalities lead to a different market, and that's where you need a higher political authority to tell the competition authority or society more generally how we're going to trade off those two different markets, a benefit in one versus a cost in another. Okay, so with that little preamble, let me just add something which is maybe a bit more relevant just now in the United States, which is these principles apply to workers and input suppliers as well. We heard a little bit about that this morning, but any kind of supplier that's not got market power, such as a driver or a farmer that raises chickens, okay? In the same way, they're fallible, they lack information, they're busy doing their work, they're behavioral. And when we have competitive markets, what that does is ensure that wages, or more generally payments to input suppliers, and the prices that we all pay as end consumers reflect competition and reflect the resources necessary to consume that product or the value of that product. And capital markets with rules prevent harmful products, deceptive products, and get us all maximal welfare. So that's why we're here. And I would say that the Digital Services Act, it's very interesting to me. A couple of years ago, if there had been a panel if there had been an event like this, it would have had a lot more to do with misinformation and bad stuff happening online, as well as green. This today has been really largely about the environment, and that piece has not emerged quite so forcefully. Why is that? I think that's because the political mechanism spoke and delivered to Europe the Digital Services Act. And the Digital Services Act is exactly supposed to help the quality of our online environment, quality of those products and services to go up, because they won't be deceptive and harmful and harming democracy and all of these kinds of things. Okay, what Jean Tirole said before lunch was that it would be really good if the political part of the European Union would deliver such a rule for carbon. And then we would not be asking the competition authority to handle these externalities from green issues and carbon issues, but we would have a framework within which those would be regulated, and we could have competition inside that framework. So I think maybe I'll just pause there, and we can come back to other questions as you go along, Louis.
Yes, good afternoon, and thank you very much for having me here. I must say I feel a little bit like an exotic animal in a competition crowd, so I hope I will not bore you too much, and I will try to provide you a little bit with the consumer perspective on competition policy and on markets. And the first remark I would like to make, or observation, is that the concept of free market is not like a spontaneous gift to humanity by the universe. In order for a market to be competitive or to be free, you need strong rules and you need an assertive enforcer, regulator. This is very important, and that's what consumers expect. Look at how you are when you are shopping or when you are in the market. You expect high level of choice, good prices, high quality. You expect your economic interest, like unfairness, to be tackled, and you take it totally for granted that what you're buying is safe. So you really rely on all those fronts of a very strong regulatory framework, and you mentioned that also. And this does not stop at the border. This is not only true for domestic markets, wherever the products come from, or wherever the companies come from, whether it's online or offline. If it's directed at the European consumer, they expect this regulatory framework to keep them safe. And this is something which is very important. And I would like already to respond to what you're saying about the behaviors of consumers. I have been working as a consumer advocate for quite some decades. And one lesson I have learned very early is that you have to work with the people like they are, not like you would like them to be. So economic models don't work with people. Just be aware of that, because that can give the bias in your economic modeling. This being said, we are proud of the European competition policy. We believe as European consumers we are in a good place. There is a lot of conversation going on where the consumer interest is being taken into account in a flexible way. We also see competition policy as and it has also been mentioned, as a very complementary tool to maximize the impact of other policies, be it food policy, be it pharmaceutical policy, be it energy policy, be it sustainability. And if somebody at DG Competition is bored, I would really like you to look into the charging prices for electric cars, because we believe that the market...
Is anyone bored?
Because we believe that one of the barriers that consumers face for the take-up of electric cars is the lack of transparency in pricing for charging your car outside of your home. And there we might maybe inspire some sector inquiry. So this is for my to-do list. What is crucial in this respect is also to see that there is a commonality between consumer policy and competition policy, because it is very important to stress in the most assertive way that those are cornerstones of our economies. If they don't work, the markets fail. What we see sometimes, there is a political pressure that those are nice to have policies. When you have a crisis, you just suspend them. We see it on consumer policy. Do you remember COVID? The first things airlines did when they had to cancel flights is to say we don't reimburse the consumer tickets. It's a right for you as an airline passenger to be reimbursed. Huh? So they just suspended your right, and they took several member states with them on that journey. Fortunately, the Commission has stopped it. And this is also true, for example, on antibiotics for the moment. There is a big push by pharmaceutical companies to derogate from competition in the pharma market by the notion of transferable exclusivity vouchers. I spare you the details of that, but it's just a derogation. It's an exemption from competition in the pharma market, which would be beyond the normal duration of the patent. Now let's maybe go for what we think could be enhanced or be improved. And there is, of course, a lot that needs to be said in the most constructive way. First of all, there is really a problem with the lack of speed of investigations in antitrust. And of course, we are not in favor of expeditive justice, certainly not, but there are too many tricks being used by the companies in order to make, it drags on for years, for decades sometimes. And in the meantime, the competitors are out of the market and the consumers are suffering harm for much too long. So this is really something that we might need maybe to reclaim as a procedure. And then at the end of the process, there is a decision. The infringement is confirmed, a huge fine, everybody applauds, but the victims are left in the cold. The competitors or the consumers who have been harmed by something that has been considered as anti-competitive, they don't see anything happening there. And this is, well, it is currently how competition policy is being constructed. But from the signal to consumers, this is not normal. They have been harmed. Why don't they get compensation? It just goes back to the budget, either of the state or of the General Union. And then just coming back to what I just said as a response to Fiona, it is very important for competition enforcers. Well, you use economic models, fair enough, but please, if it is about the consumer interest, it is very important to take account of consumer attitudes and of consumer behavior, which is not necessarily the same. And this is really very important. Also, not to speak about consumers, but with consumers. This is where you can be informed about how things happen. Just to give you a very concrete example, you see in the bank accounts market a very low level of mobility of consumers. Very few people change bank account. Now, economic theory, a satisfied consumer stays with their bank. Well, I hear some laughing. I see that already the problem is there. When you look at the consumer market scoreboard, financial services are very low in the ranking of consumer satisfaction. So why are consumers that are not satisfied staying with a bank? There must be other barriers. What are those barriers? And so this is very important to analyze further in order to address the shortcomings there in consumer mobility. Then when it maybe, am I still okay with my time?
Go ahead, yeah.
When it comes, I have still a whole book to tell you. But no, it's not true. In terms of digital now, of course, digital markets are high-speed markets. So if there is a problem of lack of speedy enforcement in traditional markets, can you imagine the harm that is being done in digital markets? And there it is really also important, and I think that Mrs. Vestager said it in a conference in Prague a few weeks ago, we have to reinvent or explore new theories of harm. There is the fact that big tech companies, who are the big players in this digital markets, they destroy ecosystems, and it's not only in the one market they're in, they are very often in different markets, and so they go across markets doing the harm, but sometimes it's even online and offline world that is impacted by their behavior. So it is really important to take a different telescope in order to see what's happening there in terms of lock-in situations. DMA. We love the DMA as a consumer organization, so well done, great achievement, congratulations. But now, of course, reality test, we have to make it happen in reality, and the resources have to be made available to the enforcers to follow up with what DMA provides them with the tools. And this is, of course, and we know that you are working on that, and we have also been trying to support any increase in enforcement resources, be it human resources, financial resources, expertise when it comes to being the geeks, understanding what's happening behind the algorithm. And so what is also important globally there is that the whole world has been watching DMA adoption. That was really like a very important development. And now the world is watching whether it's going to deliver in reality. And we really would like the EU to be a front runner and to be seen as the global regulator when it comes to DMA enforcement. And I can only promise that from the consumer perspective, we will provide as much input as our resources allow in order to make to proceed as promptly as possible. Last point I would like to suggest is about sustainability. And there I really believe it is very important to see the big picture. Whatever green policies we develop, be it food, energy, transport, what have you, at the end of the day, it's the people who have to make that change their lifestyles. You and I have to change the way we eat, the way we travel, the way we move in public or not public transport, the way we heat or cool our houses, the way we buy or not equipment, our clothes, our cosmetics, our chemicals. So that means that we need to be put in a position that we can do that. It is not fair that the individual consumer takes that responsibility. The system has to change. The sustainable option needs to become, for the consumer, the default option, meaning easy, attractive, fun, and affordable. And there, competition policy has a major role to play. Because what we see now is that there is like a sustainability bonus. Companies know very well that consumers are ready to pay more for sustainable products. They should not abuse of that. And therefore, it is really important to look into that market in order to be sure that there is not any anti-competitive practice working there. And then maybe just a last point, the narrative when it comes to sustainability has to change. Sustainability, the green transition, is a great opportunity for businesses. And if it is not a punishment. And so if companies can understand that even being in a competitive environment in Europe to develop green business models or sustainable business models, it will also enable them to become frontrunners at the global level. I'll keep it here. Thank you very much.
Shopping list, I've got it down. Electric vehicles, bank accounts, faster investigations, DMA people, and transferable.
Let me say just one sentence. When you said economic models can't predict what consumers do because they don't behave like economics, actually we have had a revolution in economics incorporating psychology into economics called behavioral economics.
Yeah, I know.
And this is now 40 years old with several Nobel Prize winners. Those models are actually what we need because they are exactly measuring what real consumers do under real circumstances. And I think this needs to be taken on board more by competition authorities and regulators, but the economics is there.
Yes, yeah. But not the
Just
use by the
defending my field. Yeah.
not the reuse by the enforcers. That's what we agree on that.
Perhaps before we come to some of the technology issues, just to take the global issue, what the Commissioner said about the open trade model. I think a speaker earlier in the day talked about not deglobalizing, but reglobalizing, doing it in a different way. Obviously, it's meeting head on with the principle of resilience, resilient economies. Is there a new trade-off? Is there at all a trade-off? We're seeing in the US things like the Inflation Reduction Act, which would be their response to resilience, which obviously has had the European Union seeking talks. How do you see the trade-off, Fiona?
I don't think there's a trade-off. I think what consumers care about is not only that, let's say, their medicines, a generic drug is available at the lowest price because there is competition, but also that the generic drug is not made in just one geographic location, so that if that location has a pandemic and everything shuts down, then there's no supply of drug to the consumers. So the consumers are interested in a resilient supply chain and in a robustness of that supply chain. I'll say that competition can deliver resilience. Let's imagine that we have a generic drug coming in from Germany and India and China to the United States. That means that if there were to be a pandemic in one of those places or an earthquake or something, we would still have access to the medicine for US consumers. So this idea that we want to build in resiliency and robustness to our thinking on competition policy is perfectly consistent with how we do it. Shortages are like a price of infinity. Shortages sometimes restrict supply not to zero and cause higher prices. Those higher prices are a traditional thing we think about and analyze when we're evaluating a merger. So we can do this with our normal framework, and if governments feel that they need to protect their people by, for example, having masks made in the home country in case the world shuts down and stops trading, then make a regulation that says hospitals must purchase masks that are made locally or something like that. And then there will be competition locally to supply those masks. So I don't see a trade-off. I also want to say that I think that the Digital Markets Act is not about trade. I know that there are people who want to say, oh, this is Europe being upset that they don't have a digital platform and cracking down on American firms. And I really don't see it that way at all. I think that it's a natural progression to regulate a new sector. We invent airplanes, we regulate airplanes. We invent drugs, we regulate drugs. We invent the telephone, we regulate the telephone. This is normal, and we are doing it with digital platforms. And when antitrust has fallen behind and we have entrenched monopolies that are preventing the next stage of competition, preventing the entry and preventing the innovation, it's very natural to regulate to achieve those goals. So I don't think it has anything to do with where a platform is located, but really about trying to benefit the consumers that live in that jurisdiction.
Monique, should resilience mean consumers prepared to pay higher prices?
I don't think so. I think that we really believe in trade. There is a lot of benefit for consumers in trade because they put more competition on the market. And I remember in the 1990s that European cars were not so good. There was a lot of rusty after 2 years or so, and then the Japanese cars came into the market. There was a liberalization, and there were, by the way, competition cases that BEUC has been taken against a cartel between the British car manufacturers and the Japanese car importers because they reduced the quota of Japanese cars on the UK market. And in fact, it's the arrival of Japanese cars who has put the competition pressure on the European car makers, and that has increased the quality of European cars. And it's the arrival, can I say, of Tesla in Europe, which has really put pressure on European car makers to get the act done with putting electric models on the market. That's why we are really regretting that part, certainly, of the Inflation Reduction Act in the United States, where it's America first. This is something that we believe is not good for American consumers, at least. Now, what we think where resilience should step in is more, and that is a double lesson that we have learned both with COVID and with the energy crisis, is the need to diversify the supply chain. Because the problem is not so much that it has been brought, that this, be it masks or be it energy, that it has been bought from abroad. The problem is that it's a single source and the supply chain. And then you have a big vulnerability if your only, let's say your only supplier or your very limited number of supplier breaks down or is not able to bring it to you.
Do you worry that resilience is used as camouflage for reintroducing national champions and European champions, which we heard from the panel before?
We don't like European champions when it comes at the costs of competition locally. Yeah, we believe it's I don't know whether it's a camouflage. I don't want to make any, as you would say in French, procès d'intention. But in terms of consequences for consumers, it would not be positive.
Yeah, I thought that what Anu said this morning, I mean, we're revisiting the role of the state. I think there's some sense that we want more state intervention. But everybody is hesitant to come right out and say, let's just have the government provide it, or let's nationalize this industry. So instead, somehow there's this middle ground, well, we will make a national champion, and somehow it will do what we want. But that's not how market power works, right? Newsflash, you create a monopolist, and the monopolist has a fiduciary duty to its shareholders and is going to make money, and you don't have any power over it anymore. So it's not a safe direction to travel. I think either just confess that what you want is state involvement and then nationalize the railroad or whatever it is you want to do and take responsibility for that and have democratic accountability for the behavior of that entity, or you have to rely on competition because the unregulated monopolist is not a good place to be. Mm-hmm.
In the US, is there a debate around single supplier and so forth like there is here, like competition's role in diversifying? I can't imagine it's as
A little bit. I mean, as you said, the Inflation Reduction Act has chip making reshored and so on. I think the difference with the United States is it's such a large country. You can have multiple production locations and firms doing any one thing, and it's all inside the same country. Now, there's, the EU is a jurisdiction, but I think it just feels a little bit different to us.
Just to come back to the DMA, obviously, digital companies are global. They often compete globally. The markets are often global. Then you stick a piece of legislation in the middle of it, which is not global, but de facto could be. Do you think that Europe then becomes, I think Anu Bradford's obviously the Brussels effect, and Brussels has a special responsibility in the same way that the dominant companies do?
I think it's going to be extremely interesting looking forward. I'm not sure I would call it a special responsibility. I mean, we didn't elect you, my people, that is, in America. You're trying to make your markets work for your society, which is marvelous. And if the United States is very lucky, we will benefit from this. I mean, we have the same concerns and many of the same groups and forces wishing to have a similar law in the United States, but our Congress doesn't legislate very often. Our democracy is having problems right now. It's very difficult for us to pass any laws. And so we are free riding, I think, off of the European Commission and what we hope what I hope anyway, will be generated by enforcement of the DMA.
I can only confirm that because we work a lot with our US counterparts, the Transatlantic Consumer Dialogue, and they are watching very closely what's happening in Europe in order to be able to say, look, it's working there, why shouldn't it work?
And I don't know what we'll see. We may see a company decide that to comply with the DMA, it's just easier to roll out the same business model globally, and people around the world benefit from that. Or a company might run a contestable business model in Europe and an exploitative one in the United States, and then economists will have a good time comparing and contrasting and measuring outcomes and seeing what that looks like. But I think it's too early to say.
What's the update us on the state of American democracy and passing the different kinds of laws that are on the table
That
there?
would take too long. No, there were proposed a number of bills for regulating digital platforms last year, perhaps. I would say there's really one remaining option standing, the American Innovation and Online Choice Act, I think is its name. It's possible that it gets voted in November after the election when everybody comes back into session, but I think that depends greatly on the outcome of the election. For example, if Republicans have won a lot of seats, then they will have no incentive to compromise and vote for something together with Democrats. They'll just wait till they're in power and have what they prefer or not have anything. So I would not put the prognosis terribly high. But it's possible. I will just note for those who are interested, it's not a regulator that this bill would establish. It's just the same process we have as in our competition law. The public authority would go to the courts and say this platform is violating this law, and we would have the same lengthy litigation. And a judge in California could rule differently than one in Maine, than one in Texas, and there'd be appeals, and it would be the same kind of mess that we have now with our competition laws.
Obviously, yeah, the question is where's the innovation going to take place? The larger companies would say they're having their arms and legs cut off in Europe, and therefore their innovation will go elsewhere. Whereas I heard a speech from Mr. Gersin yesterday, who was talking about actually in Europe, this is going to open the market. You'll find new startups having access to data, access to the market, that the innovation will take place here. And finally, Europe will get its tech companies. Where do you stand on that?
Do you want to go first, Monique?
Fully agree. I believe that putting companies under competitive pressure is a way to innovate, and that's why we always say that regulation or a regulatory framework spurs innovation much more than monopolistic situations. So we welcome that, and we really believe that that's much more powerful for European companies, not to allow the gatekeepers to strangle the market. So yes, let that competition come, and it will create innovation, and it will reinforce European companies in Europe and outside of Europe.
I think when you look at the DMA, it's really structured to benefit the business user of the platform. That seems to be the political impetus behind the DMA. So what does that mean? Contestability means that business users can get onto these platforms, can communicate with their own customers, and can extract more of the rents. The fairness part is the division of rents. So if the business user has more ability to get on, more ability to innovate on the platform, and more ability to take rents, that is creating an environment for those business users that's much better. So we would expect the return, the incentive to innovate and the ability to innovate has gone way up. So it's quite possible that we had an environment that was a stagnating monopoly with a lot of money, but no real incentive to innovate, because it's like it's in a running race with only one competitor. There's no one running behind you, so you don't have to run very fast. So that money is going, as Thomas said this morning, is going to the shareholders. If you redistribute that money to the business users and it gives them an incentive to innovate, we may see Europe being actually the place where if you want to invent a digital wallet, you have to come here. If you want to invent an app store, you have to come here. If you want to have like a music service that can communicate with its own customers, you have to come here. And so it may be that innovation in Europe is actually quite a bit stimulated, and the people who want to start those businesses can't do it in California. They have to do it here because it's the only place they can access customers.
I mean, for many years, the watchword in digital regulation has been sort of convergence. Let's keep it predictable for business. Now you've got DMA, DSA here, any number of patriotically named pieces of legislation in the US. You've got competition law coexisting alongside them. You've got the South Koreans legislating app stores, the UK taking a hard line on mergers. Is convergence still something we should desire, or should we embrace the different approaches under the watchword of resilience?
I think we haven't done enough yet for me to be terribly worried about convergence. I mean, nothing's happened, right? We have a law, but it hasn't been enforced yet. So I think until you convince me that there's a problem, like one jurisdiction is actually conflicting with another jurisdiction, I'm not going to be terribly worried about it. I think the big platforms have a lot of resources, both human resources and financial resources, to help solve that problem. And certainly regulators in all countries are not interested in having no services for their citizens. So they are going to work to make sure that this is not a disaster. So I'm a little bit thinking this is tomorrow's problem. Let's first solve today's problem.
Well, convergence is always a nice to have, but it should not be an objective in itself. And we believe that if convergence leads to inaction or to delay or to watering down of expectations that we would have domestically, we should just keep it. I mean, not go to trying to have the last mile achieved there. It's a nice to have, not a must have.
Just to come on to the topic of the conference, is sort of a silent contradiction perhaps in the title, which is making markets work, which would traditionally be a economic efficiency argument, and then for people, which is the newer fairness argument. Let's come to Monique. Is there a division between efficient markets and fair outcomes for consumers?
No, because to qualify the efficiency, you have to look at what consumers get out of it. So I think that's the litmus test for an efficient market. It's the consumer well-being. And so that is really something that is very important. And I think that markets can work for consumers, but it needs a very strong regulatory framework. The rules must be ambitious and the regulator must be assertive.
Fiona, there's a speech by Vero Bedoya from the FTC who said that efficiency had sort of hijacked the notion of competition law through the 70s and 80s and so forth, and that actually it was all about fairness to consumers. Do you see efficient markets and fairness? How do you see those marrying together?
I think that when you have a competitive price as an outcome of a setting where the internalities have been taken care of and the externalities have been taken care of, then you are really doing the best possible for the consumers who are the people. Now, what does it mean to replace the word consumers with people? It means we're thinking about clean air and democracy. Those are externalities, again, that need to be built into the rules, so that when we compete on that dimension, we don't have firms competing to be deceptive or competing saying, I have a product that has low emissions when it doesn't. Okay, so we need rules about fraud and so forth. We also need rules about how much emissions is allowed. And then once you have that floor, consumers can relax because, as Monique said earlier, they expect all products to be safe that are on the market. Likewise, I think we now would like to be in a place where we expect all products to be green. And then we can have competition among green products. And then we are having a market that works for people because the products are green and we have choices and low prices and entry and competition. So it's really just a slight broadening of scope, not to say that competition isn't any less important than it was, but just to remind ourselves that the rules of the market really matter for the outcome that we're going to get. If you ignore all the externalities and all the internalities, you're not going to get welfare for people. You might get it for the neoclassical consumer, but we're not modeling the neoclassical consumer anymore because we have all of these imperfections.
And then in the context of competition policy, that means that the notion of consumer needs to take account of the multi-dimensions of the consumer, even not speaking about the people, meaning a consumer is not just a wallet. A consumer means also some people care about sustainability, some people care about quality, some people care about about the
their
health.
online interactions not being filled with hate and disinformation.
Yeah, I mean, there is a lot of, and that's why we would really like to call on the regulators to reach out more systematically at national and at European level to the consumer voice in order to better analyze the consumer interest. And please, once a company starts saying that they care for consumers and that consumers want this, that, you really need to have like a red alert, because if they speak talking about what consumers want, that means that they have no other argument available to make their case.
Fiona, you talked about a slight broadening of scope. I mean, if I'd understood the Nobel Prize laureate's presentation earlier, which is not a given, it seemed to say, by broadening too much, we can overburden sometimes an independent regulator, overburden the regulatory process, and give them, too many issues to have to take into consideration. How do you respond
Well,
to
so
that?
first, I never disagree with Jean. That's, but also that's not what I said, which is why it's not a disagreement. What I'm trying to explain is when you draw the normal demand, supply, and you have that triangle of consumer surplus, which some of you in the audience may have seen before, okay, that thing relies on what is inside the demand curve. Is that demand curve reflecting the externalities? Is it reflecting that this is an addictive good? Is it reflecting what is in that demand curve? If we draw that demand curve very simplistically and then say we have consumer welfare, we are not getting the right answer. The full demand curve has more stuff in it. Now, is it the competition authority's problem to draw the demand curve? No, because when it's an externality, that needs to be done by political actors who can trade off carbon, jobs, green energy, whatever else has to be traded off. And once they give that demand curve and supply curve to the competition authority, then we are wanting to maximize the consumer welfare inside that system. So the broadening of scope is just reminding us that the competition authority works in an environment, and we need the political system to generate the right environment, or else the competition authority cannot maximize the thing that helps people.
Well, it's only fair of me to give you the opportunity to disagree with Professor
No,
Tirole.
I even agree with Fiona. But just to give the consumer experience there, what we are facing is that there are different agencies responsible for different aspects of the same consumer problem. And then the danger is that the consumer ends up having no agency taking care of the problem. And we need, ping-ponging and data protection is not for me. You should go to the consumer authority. Consumer authority say, oh no, that's the energy regulator. When you have like a data protection problem in a financial services contract, who is the regulator? Who is in charge of that? Is it the financial authority? Is it the competition authority? Is it the data protection authority? Is it the consumer protection authority? And I mean, the individual consumers certainly not, but even consumer organizations are struggling to knock on the right door. And when they knock on the door, then there might be really a lot of ping pong. And that's not what swift enforcement should be about.
Okay, another chance for Professor Tirole. I'm pretty sure, this is to Monique, I'm pretty sure in one of his slides he took issue with the European Commission's case against car makers over emissions standards, or emissions technology, which was about an innovation rather than a price breach or collusion. Now, do you agree with Professor Tirole?
Well, I don't agree with Professor Tirole when he says that consumers have been winning out of that, because that's a very reductive way of presenting the consumer benefit in this type of cartel, because people want clean technology, people don't want to be cheated upon, people want to have clean technology means, first of all, they care for the environment, but it's also a health issue. So just reducing the consumer benefit to an economic benefit concerning, yes, the car is cheaper as when we had done it without a cartel, that is something that should not fly anymore in the 21st century.
Fiona, to have competition policy, competition regulators work for the people, for the interests of the people, and they're staying inside their structure, is there, what can they do? Is it to do with the choice of cases, the choice of what sectors they look at, what industries they look at, the theories of harm? Is there a way that what needs to change in order that they serve, in order that they make markets work for people?
Well, I think there's a couple of different approaches. One would be to adopt a market investigation tool similar to what the CMA has in the UK. What the market investigation tool there allows the CMA to do is go into a market, figure out if competition is working well, and if it's not, very often the CMA generates a reference to another agency. Here's what seems to be wrong in insurance. Could you please promulgate some rules about whatever it might be? And so that enables a specialist in competition to say to another regulator, you're falling down on the job, you're not actually setting the rules of the road correctly in this industry, and that's causing harm to competitors. To consumers and users in that industry. Another thing to do is to intervene by lowering switching costs. So for example, Monique made a very interesting point earlier about switching bank accounts. In the UK, there's a regime called open banking. And what open banking does is it allows there to be a common set of APIs for accessing bank accounts. And this makes it tremendously easier to switch from one bank to another. Indeed, you can organize it so that that switch happens at midnight on a certain day and you're good to go the next day at your new bank account. Most consumers don't have enough money to run 2 bank accounts at the same time and wait for all of their bills to be paid on one while they open up another one. So this automatic switching of all the bill paying and everything overnight is critical to creating contestability in banking. So an authority can try to do things like that to make markets work better.
Monique, I suppose, consumers come to the regulator, your organizations come to the regulator and say, we've got a problem here. And then maybe you get the answer, well, it's not quite a competition case, or there's no case law on this or whatever. I guess you'd be urging the Commission or all regulators to just be a bit bolder?
Of course, yes. We believe that if there is one priority, and this morning I was at a single market conference, and one priority for the future program of the Commission is really to prioritize enforcement, because there is such a wealth of legislation that has been adopted, but that is just for the moment a piece of paper. Because either it's not implemented, it takes ages to be implemented by member states, or if it is implemented, it is not really enforced in practice because it's so complicated either to convince enforcement agencies to take the cases up, or then just because it just takes time because of finding evidence and making the case, and then convincing the regulators to work together, for example, in the country. And so that would be really one of the most beautiful, let's say, achievements for the next years to come, if we would have a all-encompassing enforcement system that would deliver much more quickly to the people.
And as regards the sort of, the theories of harm, there's pharmaceuticals cases which you've been involved in where arguably the Commission's doing things.
Oh yes, I mean, there is one case which we really think it's like a model case that could be really inspiring, which is the Aspen Pharma case, where really, overpricing of medicines by a dominant company, and there has been a settlement normally as a consumer organization we don't like so much settlements because then you don't have the precedent, but here the settlement the company agreed to really bring down the prices for consumers, and this is really something that has benefited quite quickly to consumers. So that was a very swift reaction by the Commission, by DG Competition, in order to clean up that dysfunctioning part of the market.
Fiona, I mean, to do that, a regulator needs to be courageous, often needs to take decisions which are sometimes at the edges of its powers. In the US, the regulator then loses in court. I mean, is there a risk? Either are they trying to go too far, or are the judges not quite up to scratch? How do you see it? Is there a risk of overstretching to serve some of these more sort of desirable goals?
Yes, I think there's legal elements to the strategy which I won't comment on, but just to say that when there's consumer harm, I think either the competition authority should move forward because they can win in court, or because they can win in the court of public opinion. If people have voted for a competition authority to protect them from monopolies, and that competition authority is going to court and trying to protect them from monopolies, and it's obvious that there's a problem, and the legal system generates a negative result, then at that point, at least it is clear to the people that they voted for something and that political party or leader is trying to protect them, and the source of the problem is the law or the way the courts are run or something, and then a democracy has ways of changing those things, passing new laws, changing the way judges are picked, or the kinds of courts, or the rules for the court to adjudicate, or whatever it might be. We can adjust that if it's not delivering the result that consumers want. But I think just thinking about it from a legal perspective does ignore this broader political response to cases where it's clear to the public that there's a problem, and yet somehow the existing rules cannot fix that problem.
I mean, towards the end of the day now, and it's about making markets work for people. People have got really one concern at the moment, and that's high prices. Yeah, it's the elephant in the room, elephant being knitted in the room. And traditionally, people have said this is sort of macroeconomic, exogenous. There's no place for a competition authority here. Maybe if there's price gouging, then you should look into that. But what is the place of, perhaps start with you, Monique, what is the place of competition enforcement for high prices, for inflation-driven prices?
Well, look at the market concentration. First of all, there is a phenomenon going on for the moment, maybe not for competition policy, but for other enforcement authorities, which is called shrinkflation. We call it shrinkflation, means that you have the same price. So it's not a price increase, but it's a reduction of the volume that you get. But it's very, it's not transparent. You just pick the same package and you don't realize that it's 50 grams less. It's a price increase, it's hidden. So that should be immediately taken. You can have an immediate action there by the national enforcement agencies. This should be immediately sanctioned because it's really unfair to consumers. But then when you look, food prices currently are going up very high, and there are good reasons in part for that because of the energy prices, but we also believe that there might be a case of concentration of the market, in the market. And the Austrian competition policy earlier this week, they have opened a sector inquiry on the food industry. So maybe this could be something other competition authorities could be looking at. In energy now, of course, for the moment, it's a full mess. But their energy companies might also be watched a little bit more closer to see how they are now managing their pricing policies, because there is a huge lack of transparency. Currently, if you want to know what you're paying per kilowatt hour, it's a black box. It is really unacceptable. So part of that is unfair marketing practices, but as the whole sector is behaving like that, maybe there is a case for looking into that sector in a more, let's say, drastic way.
Fiona?
Yeah, I think I'm not in the camp that thinks that suddenly corporations got more greedy in 2021 than they were before. I think corporations are always profit maximizing. But it is worth thinking about if we have fallen down on the job in merger and antitrust enforcement over the last 20 or 30 years, and sectors are more concentrated, they're more prone to coordinated effects. And inflation gives cover to industries that are becoming less competitive or learning how to raise prices together. So I think this is a major issue in an environment of inflation. And food, for example, while we think of food as being competitive because of the wheat farmers, actually the intermediate steps in food are quite concentrated. So that would be a prime concern. Again, a market investigation is quite a nice tool if you have it. I was in Iceland recently. They have a market investigation. And one thing they're thinking about doing is opening a market investigation in a sector where there was a shock because of the pandemic. Prices went up. Then the shock goes away, and now it's easy to get computer chips or whatever, but yet prices are not falling back again. And there you might want to investigate to find out why and perhaps try to improve competition.
Thanks. So, throwing that open to the audience for the last few minutes to get some questions, Q&A. If anyone, we've got two hands there. I'm going to take Martijn Snoep there at the front.
Thank you very much. My name is Martijn Snoep. I'm head of the Dutch Competition Authority. And I have a question that was slightly similar to the same question that was raised during the previous panels, but rephrased a bit. During the first two panels, the question was asked, do competition authorities and does competition law need to deal with externalities? And I think that is actually not the right question, or at least that's the easy question. I think that the right question and the more difficult question is, should competition law or should competition authorities stand in the way of genuine private initiatives that reduce competition on the one hand, but also reduce negative externalities?
Well, if those private initiatives aren't harming competition, then there's nothing to say. Of course, that's fine. If they're reducing competition but achieving some other green goal, then as a consumer, I want to know what is the trade-off. If you're telling me the good is 100 euros more expensive and I will get €1 in carbon benefit, I think this is a bad deal. If it's €1 higher prices and 100 euros in carbon benefit, sounds great. So now you have to measure it. And then, but again, this is what Jean Tirole was talking about this morning. This is mission creep for the agency, and it's going to be very difficult to do because we are going to ask, well, the people paying the extra 100 euros for the widget, are they the ones getting the benefit from clean air, or is it other people who didn't buy the widget at all? Now I have to care about those people, those two groups. Do I love one of the groups more than the other of the groups? Probably I shouldn't do that. Probably I should love them all the same. What about the people who live outside the European Union who are also benefiting from less carbon? Do I love them? Are we going to make the people in Europe pay high prices because there is some benefit to people in South America? So these are questions that you need your political structure to answer, not somebody who is charged with carrying out competition law, in my opinion.
Yes, and in that context, I would really like to say also, when it comes to, there could be some sort of exemptions due to sustainability, because you need to promote sustainability. And there, what we would really, you cannot ignore the effect on consumers. And there, we really would like to see serious distributional impact assessments on different segments of consumers, because you need just to be aware of what you're doing. I mean, or what the implications of that decision, specifically on the less affluent segments of consumers, because there can be as you say, there will be trade-offs, but it must be very well explained to the people also, and it must be minimized. You must find among the solutions that you might find, you must identify those that are the less, let's say, harmful for consumers.
Thank you. I'm going to take Simon Holmes this afternoon.
Thank you very much. I have a question for Monique. I very much liked your comment and agree with it, where you said that the sustainability option should be the default option, i.e. the easy option. But all too often, I experience the exact opposite. I'll give you two simple examples. The exact opposite, even where there doesn't seem to be any real cost to business, so we haven't got the same sort of trade-offs we've been talking about. Two simple domestic examples. My washing machine's default option is to go for a 4.5-hour cycle, however many times I put it onto something shorter. Why anybody would want to wash something that long beats me, but it's certainly not energy efficient, and I don't see any benefit to the manufacturers. Secondly, and a more common one, is carbon offsets. People like me might like to see it compulsory for airlines to have to offer a carbon offset. But I see no reason why they should not be obliged to at least offer a carbon offset. So my question is this something which BEUC is pressing on? And why are we seeing such resistance to these obvious default options?
Sustainability is a default.
Yes, so it is about so your washing machine by default is not energy efficient.
The washing machine is not energy efficient, a complete waste of time, and not offering a carbon offset. Airlines not offering carbon offset seems to me to make no sense. And I see no commercial reason for that to be objected to, and every reason why that sort of thing ought to be compulsory.
So there is a legislation which is called eco-design requirements, where really there is a lot of push in order to really provide people with less and less energy inefficient equipment, appliances, and this is for the moment being revised even to have a broader context. So there is work in progress there. However, it is very important to realize that there is a huge counter lobby. So even if everybody says we need to be sustainable, there is a huge counter lobby for business as usual. And then about the carbon offset. So you would favor carbon offsets?
He wants them to be offered. He thinks that every airline should give you the option.
Okay, sorry, I couldn't hear you. So first of all, everything which is a claim related to carbon neutral, we are seriously considering asking to ban them, because you cannot substantiate carbon neutrality. And if you eat bananas in Belgium, you can see carbon neutral bananas being labeled carbon neutral on your banana without any further explanation. So this is a marketing argument which has no no substantiation at all. On carbon offset schemes, we would be very cautious because there is so much misinformation and fake news around carbon offset schemes. Don't believe them. So when you see Shell, this fossil fuel company, a huge truck saying that it's carbon neutral, no. Because what they're doing is maybe planting a few trees somewhere in South Africa.
That would have been planted anyway.
That would have been,
part
yes,
of
that's
a
what I was
commercial
saying.
forest.
So the carbon offset is a big greenwashing exercise in our interpretation. And you agree with me.
I agree.
So.
Yeah.
Thank you. So, Luc Hendricks from the European Competitive Telecommunication Association. I will ask a little bit of provocative question. And you gave the example of the CMA in the UK that was analyzing some market issues and then pointing to the right authority to solve it. And Monique, you also said, and we would agree with that when you have competition cases and it takes long time, so time is of the essence, that the competitor die before the problem is solved. And what we see with the ex-ante regulation on telecom markets is that there are still many issues, and we see that there is, at least it's our opinion, that there is a kind of dogma of deregulating now. We really are entering...
Sorry, a dogma of what?
Deregulation of the market, and so it's our view that we weaken somehow even the SMP regime and so on. And we see issues in markets where the national authority does not act, or we would disagree with comment letters made by DG Connect when there are national markets regulators notifying their decisions to the European Commission. Could we imagine what would be the benefit out of it, of the competition authorities looking at ex-ante regulation and pointing to the ex-ante regulating and telling them that they are not doing a good job because we do not see the right outcome?
Oh, wait, I'm sorry, it's really hard to hear you. Can I get you to slow down? The firms pointing to the national authorities?
Yeah, so what I was thinking when you spoke about your example, could we imagine a system where the national competition authorities would look at, for example, the telecom ex-ante regulator and telecom markets in a country, and then consider that they have not done a good job, and then force them to take the right actions? Because today, if a national regulatory authority does not act, there is nothing we can do. And even more than that, more controversial.
We've got that. Sure, just answer that point.
I think that's what the CMA does. They investigate, they see competition is not working, and they go to the relevant authority and say, you need a new rule, or a better rule, or a different rule, because the one you've got is not getting the job done. I think that's how it works.
And could we imagine the same at European level, where DG Competition would say to DG Connect, we do not agree with your position on this market analysis because it has wrong?
Primus inter pares.
And more generally,
I'm going to stay away from that one.
Or can competition law help to better enforce ex-ante regulation?
Is that the role of a competition
I think we want competition law and regulation to work as complements. The idea is that the regulation is covering problems that are frequent, that are understood, and that should run quickly, efficiently, smoothly. But we always have the competition law for something new, something that is unusual, that was unexpected, and is not competition on the merits. But if you do everything with competition law, it just takes too long. And that you're doing one case at a time when in fact there's lots of them. And you would just like a blanket rule to cover all of them.
Thank you. We're going to take a question from Slido, which is, how could we conceive and integrate notions like democracy and sustainability in competition rules? Either you want to take that?
Well, I would say we heard this morning this is a bad idea. So I think we don't want to do that. I think we want to have the parts of government that are able to trade. So let's imagine, like the Dutch, we're going to say that green is part of competition law, and we're going to have a ton of carbon is worth 80 euros, and so the price can go up by 80 euros as long as the tons of carbon go down by 80 euros. Okay, that's already complicated because there's people who consume the product, people who don't consume the product and live in the Netherlands, people who don't consume the product and live in France, people who don't consume the product and live in Brazil. That's hard. What are the units of democracy we're going to use? Well, the price goes up by 100 euros. How many units does democracy have to go up to offset 100 euros? I don't even know where to start with that. So this is why I think it's not a good idea.
Monique, there is pressure to make competition law do stuff for democracy and do stuff for plurality and so forth. You can see parts of that coming in the recent Google ruling. There's kind of flirtations with it.
Well, I don't know whether I have a solution for that, but certainly I can contribute to the problem. No, because the point is there is a huge, with digital markets, we see a huge, I call it permeability between markets and societies. And the fact that you as a consumer are being put in a bubble because they know you so well is also a major problem for the democracy, because as a citizen you will be put in that same bubble, and they will, the things that you will see before the elections is not the same that I will see before the elections. So this is so that means that if there is an abuse of your data by a gatekeeper, that has a major effect on democracy. So that could be a way, so competition policy or enforcement could be part of the solution in keeping that under control.
Well, but I think this is what the Digital Services Act is trying to do. That's not competition policy, that's regulation of a harmful product, disinformation, misinformation that causes either health and disease in the person who reads it, or harm to the society she lives in. Mm-hmm. So I think this is the political response, to pass a set of rules that limit this kind of bad situation.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, everyone. I'm going to take one last question from Janis.
It works. Just
only because it's you, Janis.
So Yanis Lianos from the Greek Competition Authority. So it's a question about what was discussed before concerning the food markets. So we live in a global food system, and parts of that system are concentrated. I think the war in Ukraine right now makes it more difficult with regards to concentration as well. And of course, competition authorities, they take only a look on their own local markets. But because, this is a global system, maybe, there is something missing in the picture. What are your thoughts about the way competition authorities might react to the current problems, which are not necessarily always competition related, but might be competition related of the global food system? And the second thing, I could hardly resist, Fiona, what you said before. There might be some possibilities that you can assess, possibly sustainability effects from one side, and competition effects from the other side. We do that in impact assessment analysis. Why can't we do that also in the context of competition law analysis?
Let me take the first one, because then maybe I'll leave Monique the second one. I think that a lot of these big agribusinesses like Cargill's and Archer Daniels Midland and so forth are operating in multiple countries. So it certainly seems like a fertile place for competition authorities from different countries to collaborate and share information about what is happening to the markets in their country, and maybe that together would piece together a story that is more compelling or understandable and then lead to some ideas for a solution. I think that's a great example.
Monique?
By the way, just to mention, the Ukraine crisis has not given a food availability crisis in Europe, only a food affordability crisis. So that's already a signal that should maybe be interesting for competition authorities. No, on the sustainability, I would, of course, encourage to have sustainability in the checklist of the competition authority, but that's because as a consumer organization, I would like to minimize the number of doors we have to knock on in order to have some illegal activity to be enforced.
Thank you very much. I'm going to put an end to it there. I had one job, which is to finish on time, and I've not completed that. We've run over, but we've solved the problem of making markets work for people, so all good. We're now going to hand back to Alexander and Olivier to close out the day. I'd just like to ask you to thank my panelists in the normal way. Thank you.